The parchment felt heavier than stone in June Whitfield's hands. Each word, penned in the severe, elegant script of the Alpha King's Council, was a link in a chain binding her future. Surrogacy, heir, compensation, termination. The words were cold, clinical, stripped of all emotion, which was a mercy. If there had been any hint of warmth, any suggestion of humanity in the document, she might have broken. As it was, she could treat it as what it was, a business transaction. Her womb for her family's survival. A fair trade, her mind insisted, even as her heart clenched into a tight, painful knot. The old farmhouse, with its peeling paint and fields lying fallow, was all she had left of them. Her parents were gone, taken by the rogue fever 2 seasons past, leaving her with their debts and the crushing weight of their legacy. The farm had been in the Whitfield family for generations. Selling it would be like selling their bones. This contract, this impossible, terrifying contract, was the only other way. Alpha King Drakenthorn watched her from across the massive obsidian desk that dominated his study. He was precisely as the stories described, a titan carved from granite and shadow, with eyes the color of a winter storm. Grief had hollowed out the warmth in him, leaving a chilling emptiness that radiated from him in palpable waves. It had been 3 years since his mate, Rowena, had been taken by a rival pack's ambush. 3 years since the light had gone out of his world, leaving only duty and the gnawing ache of a severed bond. Rowena had been his fated mate, the one the moon goddess herself had written into his soul before he had ever drawn breath. Her loss was not just the loss of a woman he loved, it was the loss of a piece of his very being. His wolf, a great black beast that mirrored his own formidable size, had fallen silent ever since, a phantom of rage and sorrow pacing within him, but his kingdom needed an heir. The Council of Elders, led by the perpetually grim-faced Lord Aldrich, reminded him of this daily. His bloodline was ancient, powerful, and without a direct successor, the stability of the entire Northern Territory was at risk. He had refused to seek a new mate. The very idea felt like standing on Rowena's grave and calling it a garden. The fated bond was a sacred, once-in-a-lifetime miracle, and he would not insult her memory by pretending otherwise. So, this was his solution. A surrogate, a means to an end, a vessel to carry the Thorn legacy forward without the complication of emotion, without the ghost of a love he could never feel again. He had chosen her from a list of candidates, June Whitfield, an Omega. Small and graceful, with a quiet resilience that marked her as someone accustomed to hardship. She was desperate, which meant she would be compliant. Her file said she was resilient and quiet and carried no scandals. She was perfect for the role. Invisible. "You have read the terms, Miss Whitfield?" His voice was a low rumble, devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a king accustomed to giving orders, not making conversation. June's gaze flickered up from the contract. She met his stormy gray eyes for a brief, terrifying second, before looking down again. Submitting to an alpha's gaze was instinct, but this felt different. It felt like standing on a cliff edge in a gale. "I have, Your Majesty." Her own voice was a whisper, but it was steady. She would not show him her fear. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. Pride was the only currency she had left. The terms are clear. Clear as ice. She would live in the castle, provided for, but isolated. She would have no contact with the outside world, and upon the birth of the child, she would relinquish all rights, accept her payment, and vanish. There was a clause, number 7, that felt particularly cruel. The surrogate will make no attempt to bond with the child. How did one command a heart not to feel? Draken's wolf, the silent passenger in his soul, stirred for the first time in years. It wasn't a roar, not a surge of power, but a slow, curious uncurling. It was her scent. Beneath the sterile scent of the castle's polished wood and beeswax, he could detect something faint and achingly pure. wild primrose and damp earth after a spring rain, a scent of life, of resilience, and it was a stark contrast to the sterile grief that had become his world. He dismissed it, a momentary anomaly. "You will sign, and the funds will be transferred to settle your family's accounts by nightfall," he stated, pushing an inkwell and a quill across the desk. The quill was fashioned from a raven's feather, its tip sharpened to a deadly point. June reached for it, her fingers brushing the polished obsidian surface. A strange jolt, like static electricity, passed between the desk and her skin. She flinched, pulling her hand back for a second. Draken's eyes narrowed slightly, tracking the movement. He had felt it too, a bizarre warmth that had no business being there. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone hardening. He had no time for second thoughts. "No, Your Majesty." June took a breath and grasped the quill. Her hand was shaking now, but she forced it to be still. She dipped the tip into the jet-black ink and moved it to the bottom of the parchment. Her name, June Whitfield, looked small and insignificant next to the king's seal. As the last letter was formed, she felt a profound and irreversible shift in her world. She had just sold her soul. She slid the contract back across the desk. She did not watch him sign his own name. She simply stared at her hands, resting in her lap, feeling the phantom weight of the gold that would save her home, but cost her everything else. "It is done," Draken announced, his voice sealing her fate. "Beta Corvan will show you to your chambers. You will begin your new life immediately." He didn't say welcome. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. He simply stood, a towering silhouette against the tall, arched window, and turned to look out over his kingdom. The audience was over. June was no longer a person, she was an asset. Beta Corvan, a man with a kind face and weary eyes, led her through a labyrinth of cold, echoing corridors. The castle was a masterpiece of stone and power, but it was utterly devoid of warmth. Tapestries depicting glorious battles and ancient kings lined the walls, their woven eyes seeming to follow her with silent judgment. The servants she passed averted their gazes, their faces carefully blank. She was an anomaly, a secret, and they all knew it was safer not to see her. Her rooms were in the forgotten East Wing. They were luxurious, far grander than anything she had ever known, with a soft bed, a private bathing chamber, and a small balcony overlooking a manicured but empty garden. But the opulence felt like a cage. The door closed behind Corvan with a soft but final click, and June was utterly alone. She walked to the window and looked out. In the distance, beyond the castle walls, she could just make out the dark line of the Whisperwood forest. Her home was somewhere beyond that, nestled in the valley. A wave of homesickness so powerful it made her dizzy washed over her. She pressed a hand to her flat stomach. A tear, hot and traitorous, escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. She had made her choice. There was no room for tears. Not now, not ever. She was the surrogate, the vessel, a ghost in the king's castle, waiting to fulfill a purpose that would both save her and break her in two. June had always had a wolf. She had shifted for the first time at 14, like all her kind, in the middle of a cold autumn night in the apple orchard behind her family's farmhouse. Her wolf was small, soft-footed, and golden, a quiet creature, as omega wolves often were. She had never been the kind of wolf that growled for dominance or strained against her skin with restless power. Her wolf simply endured, steady and unhurried, much like June herself. In the weeks after her arrival at the castle, she noticed her wolf had grown quieter still, as if the stone walls pressed in on its spirit. It wasn't gone, it was simply waiting, the way a flame waits behind cupped hands in the wind. As the weeks passed, the terms of their arrangement were fulfilled in the way that nature intended, conducted with careful distance and even more careful silence. Neither of them speaking of it afterward, as if acknowledging it would make the reality of their situation even more unbearable. A cold professionalism governed everything, and June was grateful for it, because the alternative, letting herself feel, was a luxury the contract did not permit. The royal healer, a stern-faced woman named Marin, oversaw every aspect of her health with detached efficiency. She spoke to June as if she were a prized mare, discussing her diet, her sleep, her cycle, with a professionalism that was almost more insulting than outright cruelty. Draken received Marin's reports via written messages, maintaining a clinical distance. June spent her days reading books from the small collection left in her room, pacing the length of her gilded cage, or staring out at the unchanging garden. The silence was her constant companion, broken only by the soft footfalls of the servant who brought her meals on a silver tray and left them outside her door. One morning, Marin arrived with a different energy. There was a flicker of something in her eyes, not warmth, but a kind of professional triumph. "The signs are confirmed," she announced without preamble. "You are with child." June's breath caught in her throat. She sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, her hand instinctively flying to her abdomen. A life, a tiny, fragile spark was growing inside her. A life that was not hers to keep. The joy that tried to flutter in her chest was instantly smothered by the cold, hard weight of the contract. Clause 7. She forced her hand away from her stomach. She had to start now. She had to build the wall between herself and this tiny being. "The air is healthy?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Marin nodded. "The initial signs are strong. The Alpha King will be pleased." Draken received the news in his study. He read the healer's note twice, his face an unreadable mask. An heir. His heir. A continuation of his line, a future for his kingdom. It was what he wanted, what he needed. Yet the thought of this child, growing inside a woman he barely knew, felt abstract and deeply unsettling. His wolf, however, was not so conflicted. A low, possessive rumble vibrated in his chest. Our pup. The thought was so clear, so primal, it startled him. He pushed it down, irritated. It was not our pup. It was his heir. The woman was merely the means. He told himself this over and over, a litany against the strange pull he felt toward the East Wing. He found himself altering his path from the council chambers, his feet carrying him down the long, silent corridor that led to her rooms. He never stopped. He would just walk past, straining his senses, catching the faint, clean scent of primrose that seemed to cling to the air around her door. It was a foolish, irrational impulse, and he hated himself for it, but he couldn't seem to stop. The morning sickness began a week later. It was a relentless, draining nausea that left June pale and weak. She spent her mornings retching into a basin, her body rebelling against the new life it carried. Through it all, she held on to one thought. This was for the heir. The discomfort was part of the service she was providing. One afternoon, as she was trying to sip some weak tea, a different servant appeared at her door. A young girl with wide, nervous eyes. "His Majesty, the Alpha King, sent this," the girl whispered, placing a tray on the table. On it was not the usual bland broth, but a small portion of ginger-infused crackers and a specific herbal tea known to soothe upset stomachs. It was exactly what her body craved. June stared at the tray. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but it was the first crack in the icy facade of her isolation. He was thinking of her. Not as June, perhaps, but as the carrier of his heir. Still, it was something. She ate the crackers slowly, the ginger easing the churning in her stomach. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel entirely alone. The first formal healer's appointment to check the pup's progress was scheduled for the following week. Marin had informed June that the king's presence was required. He needed to witness the health of his investment. June dreaded it. She had grown accustomed to her solitude, and the thought of being in the same room with him made her stomach clench with a sickness that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. When he entered the examination room, he filled it entirely. His presence was overwhelming, a physical force that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed on Marin, his expression stern and impatient. "Proceed," he commanded. June lay on the examination table, a thin sheet covering her. She felt exposed, vulnerable, a specimen under a microscope. Marin pressed a smooth, rounded crystal against her skin, a lunar stone, enchanted to amplify the faint sounds of life within the womb. A soft, rhythmic thumping filled the room. Thump, 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 thump. It was fast, a frantic, vital sound, the sound of a tiny heart beating with fierce determination. June's breath hitched. All her resolve, all her carefully constructed walls, threatened to crumble at that sound. Her baby's life. No, she corrected herself fiercely, the heir's life. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out, trying to sever the connection that was already forming against her will. Draken stood frozen. He had expected to feel nothing. He had prepared himself for a clinical report, a confirmation of viability. He had not prepared for this. That sound bypassed his mind, his grief, his duty, and struck him directly in the soul. It was the most profound sound he had ever heard. His wolf surged forward, not with rage, but with a wave of overwhelming, primal protectiveness. Our pup. This time he couldn't push the feeling down. It was too strong. His stormy eyes, against his own volition, moved from the healer's stone to June's face. Her eyes were squeezed shut, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of the table. She was fighting it. She was trying to deny the sound, to deny the life inside her. And in that moment, he saw her not as a vessel, not as a surrogate, but as a woman in a battle against her own heart. A strange, unwelcome ache bloomed in his chest, dangerously close to empathy. He took a half step toward the table, his hand lifting slightly as if to offer comfort, before he caught himself. He clenched his fist and let it drop to his side. What was he doing? This was not part of the contract. "The heir is strong," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He turned on his heel and strode from the room without another word, the frantic, beautiful sound of that tiny heartbeat echoing in his ears. He fled, but the sound followed him. The castle seemed to shrink around June as the weeks turned into months. Her world was composed of her 3 rooms, the silent garden, and the weekly visits from Marin. Yet something had shifted after that first appointment. The king's presence, which had once been a terrifying abstraction, was now a subtle but constant weight on the periphery of her life. The special meals continued to arrive, tailored to her needs and cravings before she even knew she had them. One day, a collection of new books appeared on her table. Not histories of war, but tales of adventure and far-off lands, stories she had mentioned enjoying in passing to the healer weeks ago. He was listening. The thought was both comforting and deeply alarming. She was supposed to be invisible, a temporary fixture. Instead, she felt seen. She began to show. The slight curve of her abdomen became a gentle, undeniable swell. It was a constant physical reminder of the life she was nurturing. She still fought the urge to rest her hands there, to whisper to the tiny being within. She would stand before the mirror and stare at her changing reflection, her expression a mixture of awe and sorrow. She took to calling him the little prince in the privacy of her own mind. It was safer than my son. It maintained the distance, the formal separation required by her role. Deep in the quiet of those long evenings, she sometimes felt her wolf stir at the edges of her consciousness. Not with the restless energy of a wolf seeking a shift, but with something slower and more wondering, the way a flower turns its face toward a light it hasn't yet felt the warmth of. Draken's nights became restless. Sleep offered no escape from the turmoil in his mind. His wolf, now fully awake and insistent, paced the confines of his soul, demanding proximity to the female and the pup. "Our pack," it growled, a low, constant refrain. "Protect our pack." It was madness. She was not his mate. He had loved his fated mate, had buried her and the piece of himself that had belonged to her. What his wolf was feeling now was something different, not the thunderclap recognition of a fated bond, but a slow, deliberate pull, like a tide choosing the shore. He had no name for it yet, and so he refused to think about it at all. He took to walking the halls at night, his bare feet silent on the cold stone floors. His path always ended in the same place, the corridor outside her chambers. He would stand there in the darkness, leaning against the opposite wall, just listening. Sometimes he could hear the faint rustle of her turning in bed. Sometimes he could hear her sigh, a soft, lonely sound that echoed the hollow ache in his own chest. He told himself he was standing guard. The heir was his kingdom's future. It was his duty as king to ensure its safety. But as he stood there, his senses strained, he found himself focusing not on the abstract concept of an heir, but on the woman sleeping just a few yards away. One night, he heard a small cry of pain from within the room. Before he could think, he was at her door, his hand on the handle, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stopped himself just before turning it. He had no right. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the door, a low growl of frustration rumbling in his chest. He stayed there for over an hour, until the silence within the room was deep and steady again, before finally retreating to his own cold, empty bed. The next healer's appointment was different. Draken didn't wait for a summons. He simply appeared at the designated time. June was already there, seated on the edge of the examination table. She looked up in surprise when he entered, her eyes wide. She looked tired, the skin beneath her eyes smudged with purple. "Your Majesty," she murmured, her gaze dropping to her hands, which were clasped tightly in her lap over her now noticeably rounded stomach. He didn't reply, simply giving Marin a curt nod to begin. The lunar stone was placed on her belly, and once again the room filled with the strong, steady beat of the pup's heart. But this time, there was something else. As Marin moved the stone, a sudden, sharp flutter of movement occurred beneath it. June gasped, her hands flying to her stomach. "Oh!" Draken's eyes shot to her belly. "What was that?" "The pup is kicking," Marin said, a rare, small smile touching her lips. "A strong one, it seems." Another flutter, more pronounced this time. June's face was transformed. The exhaustion and worry were momentarily wiped away, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. A soft, breathless laugh escaped her lips. It was the first time Draken had ever heard her laugh. The sound was like a key turning in a lock he hadn't known was rusted shut. An impulse, overwhelming and undeniable, seized him. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched. He simply laid his palm flat against her stomach, right where the last movement had been. The world seemed to stop. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that had nothing to do with royal duty. June froze, her breath catching in her chest. His hand was huge, warm, and impossibly gentle against her skin, separated only by the thin fabric of her dress. His touch was a brand, a shock of heat that spread through her entire body. Beneath his palm, the baby kicked again, a firm, distinct tap directly against his hand. Draken's own breath hitched. He stared down at his hand, at the place where he was physically connected to his child for the first time. A tiny, perfect, undeniable miracle. His gaze lifted and met June's. Her eyes were wide, luminous, and filled with a universe of unspoken emotions. Awe, fear, and a deep, soul-shattering sadness. In that moment, they were not a king and a surrogate. They were a man and a woman, sharing the first kick of their child. The intimacy of the moment was terrifying. June was the first to break the spell. She gently shifted, pulling back just enough to dislodge his hand. The loss of contact was a physical jolt to them both. "The air is active," she said, her voice strained. She had put the wall back up, brick by painful brick. "The air, not our baby." Draken's hand fell to his side, feeling suddenly cold and empty. He had seen behind her mask, just for a second, and the vulnerability he'd witnessed shook him to his core. He cleared his throat, retreating behind his own mask of authority. "See that she has everything she needs, Marin," he commanded, his voice gruff. "The heir's development is paramount." He turned and left, the feeling of that tiny kick still phantom thrumming against his palm. The contract was burning, not on paper, but in his mind. Its cold, hard letters were turning to ash, and he didn't know how to stop the fire. The court was a viper's nest, and Draken had grown adept at navigating its venomous whispers. But the growing talk about the Omega in the East Wing was a new kind of poison. His frequent walks, the special meals, his abrupt departures from council meetings, none of it had gone unnoticed. The whispers centered on one particularly ambitious she-wolf, Lady Vivian. She was of a high-ranking bloodline, beautiful and cunning, and had made it no secret that she believed herself the perfect candidate to be the new Luna Queen. She saw June not as a person, but as an obstacle. A low-born nobody who had somehow ensnared the king's attention. Draken knew Vivian's ambition was dangerous. She saw the heir growing in June's belly as her own path to the throne. His wolf bristled at the mere thought of Vivian near June. He tightened security around the East Wing, posting his most loyal guards, the Draken Guard, at every entrance, and at June's shoulder whenever she walked in the more public areas of the grounds. June was not oblivious to the shift in the castle's atmosphere. The few servants she encountered now looked at her with a mixture of fear and open curiosity. She heard the whispers. She saw the glares from gorgeously dressed noblewomen. She felt like a prize animal on display. One afternoon, while taking a slow walk near the garden's ornate fountain with two of the Draken Guard shadowing her at a respectful distance, Lady Vivian appeared. She had timed it with the precision of a predator, approaching from a narrow colonnade path that placed a row of hedges between her and the guards before they could close the gap. She was flanked by two other she-wolves, their expressions identically smug. Vivian was stunning, with hair the color of spun gold and eyes like chips of emerald. "Well, well," Vivian said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The famous vessel. You are larger than I imagined." She let her eyes roam over June's swollen form with a look of clinical distaste. June's hand instinctively went to her belly, a protective shield. She said nothing, merely inclining her head in a gesture of respect she did not feel. "The king takes a great interest in his investment," Vivian continued, circling her slowly like a predator sizing up prey. "One might almost think he cares for the incubator, not just what is inside it." The insult was sharp and deliberate. June's chin lifted. "The king is concerned for the health of his heir, as is his duty." "His heir," Vivian purred, stopping directly in front of her. "Yes, he will need a mother, of course. A true Luna of noble blood to guide him. Someone like me." She reached out, her long manicured nails aiming for June's stomach. Before her fingers could make contact, a blur of motion intervened. Draken's hand shot out, grabbing Vivian's wrist in a grip of iron. He had appeared from behind the colonnade, his movement utterly silent and lethally fast, the two guards snapping to attention at his heels. His face was a thundercloud of pure fury. His eyes, usually the color of a storm, were now flashing with the molten gold of his wolf. A low, guttural growl vibrated from his chest, so primal and threatening that Vivian's companions took an involuntary step back, baring their necks in submission. "You will not touch her," Draken snarled, his voice a low promise of violence. He wasn't speaking as a king. He was speaking as an alpha, a male protecting what was his. Vivian's face went pale. "Draken, your Majesty, I was simply—" "I know what you were doing," he cut her off, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. He squeezed her wrist and she winced. "This is your only warning, Vivian. Stay away from her. If I see you near her again, if I even hear a whisper of a threat directed at her, I will strip you of your title and cast you out into the wastes as a rogue. Do you understand me?" Vivian choked out her assent, and he shoved her wrist away in disgust. "Go," he commanded. She and her companions practically fled, their retreat hasty and graceless. Draken turned to June. She was staring at him, her face ashen, her hand pressed to her heart. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice still rough with the remnants of his rage. She could only nod. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them for a moment, before he gently cupped her cheek. His thumb stroked her skin, a gesture of profound tenderness that stood in stark contrast to the violence he had just threatened. "I will not let anyone harm you," he vowed, his golden eyes locking with hers. "You or the pup. You are under my protection. Entirely." That night, he had a cot and bedding moved into the small antechamber connected to her room, the door between them left slightly ajar. He was no longer just a king ensuring the safety of an heir. He was a wolf guarding his den. She could hear him breathing as she tried to sleep. She could feel his presence, a steady, grounding force just on the other side of the door. The castle was still a cage, but now, for the first time, she had a guardian. And his presence made her feel more trapped and more protected than ever before. The final weeks of the pregnancy passed in a strange, suspended reality. The overt threats from the court ceased, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Draken's public declaration had been unequivocal. June was untouchable. They fell into a quiet domesticity that defied the cold print of the contract. He would sit in a chair in her room while she read, the two of them not speaking, simply sharing the space. When she had trouble sleeping, he would talk to her, his low voice a soothing rumble in the darkness. He didn't speak of court politics or royal duties. He spoke of the forest, of the stars, of the history of his people before they were kings. He told her about his own wolf, the great black beast, and how its silence had been born of a grief so profound it had nearly extinguished his spirit. He told her that Rowena had been the other half of his soul, a gift from the moon goddess herself, and that losing her had felt like losing the North Star. He said it without the raw agony that had once defined every word he spoke of her. He said it as a man who had learned to carry his grief, rather than be buried beneath it. June listened, and she understood what he did not say. That a door inside him, one he had believed sealed forever, had begun, very slowly, to open. In return, June found herself opening up in ways she never thought she would. She told him about her family's farm, about the scent of the apple blossoms in the spring and the feel of the rich earth in her hands. She spoke of her parents, her father's booming laugh, her mother's gentle hands braiding her hair. She was sharing the pieces of her soul, and he was gathering them up as if they were precious gems. One night, as she struggled to get comfortable, a sharp pain in her back making her cry out, he was at her side in an instant. He helped her to a chair and, without a word, began to massage the knotted muscles in her lower back. His touch was sure and steady, and under his hands, the pain slowly receded. "You should have called for me," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I didn't want to disturb you," she whispered. "You are never a disturbance, June," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. He rested his forehead against her shoulder, his eyes closing. "My wolf is restless when you are in pain. It wants to take the hurt from you." This confession hung in the air between them. It was as close to a declaration as he could come without shattering the last, fragile illusion of their arrangement. June's heart ached with a love she was terrified to name. She loved this broken, beautiful king, and she loved the child he had given her, the child she would have to give up. The knowledge was a constant, sharp pain beneath the surface of their quiet moments. She kept her shield in place with one simple, brutal tactic. She never referred to the baby as our child. It was always the heir, the pup, or your son. Every time she said it, it was a small cut to her own heart, but it was also a cut to his. She could see him flinch, a brief tightening of his jaw, a flicker of hurt in his eyes. It was a cruel kindness, a way of reminding them both of the chasm between them, the contract, the termination, the end that was rushing toward them with every beat of her child's heart. A week before the pup was due, Marin came for a final examination. Draken stood by the window, his arms crossed, his posture rigid with tension. After a few moments, Marin smiled. "Everything is perfect. The heir is in position and could arrive any day now." Draken's gaze flew to June. Her face was pale. The reality of the impending birth, and what came after, was starkly written in her eyes. After Marin left, a heavy silence filled the room. "June," Draken began, his voice strained. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. "We need to talk about what happens next." June's heart plummeted. "There is nothing to talk about, Your Majesty. The contract is very clear." Her voice was brittle, fragile. "To hell with the contract," he growled, the sound ripped from his chest. "I can't. I won't." He couldn't finish the sentence. June steeled herself. This was it, the moment she had been dreading. She had to be strong, for both of them. "You are the king," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You made a law. You wrote the terms. I agreed to them." She finally looked up and met his anguished gaze. "I will honor my word. I expect you to honor yours." His face crumpled. The king was gone, and only the broken man remained. "I was wrong," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I was a fool, drowning in grief, and I created this monstrosity of a plan. I never expected you." "You expected a vessel," she finished for him, her own heart breaking. "And that is what I am. I will deliver your heir, and then I will leave. It is the only way." He reached for her, but she took a step back, shaking her head. A tear traced its way down her cheek. "Please, Draken," she whispered his name, a plea. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." He froze, his hand dropping to his side. The pain in his eyes was a physical blow. He gave a single, sharp nod, his jaw clenched so tight it was a wonder it didn't crack. He turned and walked out of the room, closing the door to the antechamber behind him. June sank onto her bed, a sob tearing from her throat, her hands protectively cradling the child she was about to lose. The first contraction hit her in the dead of night, a sharp, clenching fist deep in her belly. She gasped, her body going rigid. Another followed a few minutes later, stronger this time. She lay in the darkness, breathing through the waves of pain, a strange sense of calm settling over her. This was the final act. She didn't call for him. She wanted to hoard these last hours, these last moments where the baby was still hers, safe inside her. But he knew. A wolf's senses, especially one whose instincts were screaming that someone he had come to care for was in distress, were not so easily fooled. The door to the antechamber burst open. Draken stood there, silhouetted against the hall light, his hair disheveled, his eyes wide with frantic, wild energy. "June?" His voice was raw with panic. She managed a weak smile. "It's time, Your Majesty." The title was a reflex, a last piece of her crumbling armor. He was across the room in 3 long strides. "Marin!" he roared, his voice booming through the silent castle, a king's command that would be instantly obeyed. He knelt by her bed, taking her hand in his. His was trembling. "I'm here," he said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "I'm right here." The hours that followed were a chaotic blur of pain and strained intimacy. Marin and 2 other healers arrived, their calm professionalism a stark contrast to Draken's barely restrained panic. He refused to leave June's side. He held her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles. He wiped the sweat from her brow with a cool cloth. When the pain became a relentless, tearing force, he let her grip his hand with all her strength, his bones groaning under the pressure, but his expression never changed. He murmured to her, not words of encouragement, but promises. "I'm here, June. I won't leave you. Breathe with me. You are the strongest person I know. Just breathe." He was her anchor in a storm of agony. At one point, in the throes of a particularly brutal contraction, she cried out his name, a raw, desperate sound. "Draken!" He leaned in close, his forehead pressing against hers. "I'm here," he repeated, his voice thick. "My brave June, I'm here." In the haze of pain, the lines blurred. He was not a king. She was not a surrogate. They were a man and a woman bringing their child into the world. It was the most beautiful and most painful illusion. Finally, after an eternity of effort, Marin's voice cut through the fog. "One more push, June. I can see the head." Draken's grip on her hand tightened. "You can do this," he breathed, his eyes locked on hers, pouring all of his strength into her. With a final guttural cry torn from the very depths of her soul, June gave one last monumental push. And then a new sound filled the room. The thin, wailing cry of a newborn baby. Relief so profound it was dizzying washed over her. She fell back against the pillows, utterly spent, her body trembling with exhaustion. "A boy," Marin announced, her voice filled with warmth. "A healthy, strong alpha prince." Through a blur of tears and sweat, June saw the healer clean the baby and wrap him in a soft linen blanket. He was beautiful. Perfect. He had a shock of dark hair, just like his father. Marin moved to place the baby in June's arms. It was the natural thing to do, the only thing to do. But June turned her head away, her heart shattering into a million pieces. "No," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. The room went silent. The only sound was the baby's soft whimpering. "June," Draken began, his voice choked. "The contract," she said, her eyes squeezed shut against the tears streaming down her face. "Give him to his father." Marin froze, looking from June's agonized face to the king's stunned one. With trembling hands, she turned and placed the warm, wriggling bundle into Draken's arms. He took the baby automatically, his gaze still locked on June. He looked down at the tiny face, at the son he had wanted, the heir he had commissioned. The baby stared up at him, his crying softening to a small hiccup. This tiny being was his blood, his future, and holding him felt like holding a fistful of ashes, because the woman who had given him this miracle was preparing to leave. June used the last of her strength to push herself up from the bed. Every muscle screamed in protest, and her legs shook beneath her with the effort of bearing weight they had not carried in hours. Marin moved to stop her. "You need to rest." "I am fine," June said, though the words cost her. She wrapped a thin robe around herself, and with shuffling, unsteady steps that she forced herself not to let become a stumble, she started walking. She walked past the bed, past the healers, past the king holding their son. She walked toward the door. Each step was a lifetime. Each step was a nail in her own coffin. She reached the door and pulled it open, her eyes fixed on the long, empty corridor ahead. She took a step across the threshold, ready to walk toward the gates, toward her freedom, toward a life that was now utterly devoid of meaning. "Stop." The word was not a king's command. It was a shattered, desperate plea. June froze in the doorway, her back to him, her shoulders trembling. She could hear him moving, his footsteps urgent. He caught up to her in an instant, stopping directly behind her. She could feel the heat of his body, could hear the soft sounds of the baby in his arms. "June, turn around," he begged, his voice breaking. She shook her head, a sob catching in her throat. "I can't." "Please," he whispered. Slowly, painstakingly, she turned. He stood before her, the great and powerful Alpha King, with tears streaming down his face. He held their son out to her, a desperate offering. The baby was fussing, his little fists waving in the air. "The contract says you leave," Draken said, his voice thick with unshed emotion. He reached into his tunic with his free hand and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. The contract. Their contract. "I'm burning it," he declared, his voice ringing with a new conviction, the voice of a king making a new law. "I'm burning it all. Stay." His stormy eyes, now clear and bright with tears, pleaded with her. "Stay, as my Luna, as his mother." He took a ragged breath, his next words a raw, vulnerable confession that laid his soul there. "As mine. Not by fate, June, Not by the moon goddess's design. By my choice. I am choosing you. The carefully constructed walls of her heart didn't just crumble, they were obliterated. Her gaze fell from his face to the baby in his arms. Their son. Her son. The word echoed in her heart, a truth she had so long denied. With trembling hands, she reached out and took the baby from him. He was so light, so warm. He settled instantly in her arms, his fussing ceasing as he snuggled against her chest, his tiny nose burrowing into her robe. He knew her. He knew his mother. She looked down at his perfect, tiny face, and a love so fierce, so overwhelming, it stole her breath, filled her completely. The noise from the corridor beyond reached them then, the sharp strike of boots on stone, the low rumble of raised voices. Lord Aldrich appeared at the far end of the hallway, 2 senior council members flanking him, their faces set with a specific kind of disapproval that only men who have spent decades guarding tradition could muster. "Your Majesty," Aldrich said, his voice crisp and carrying. "We have been informed of a disturbance. The contract is void," Draken said, without turning around. His voice was quiet, but it silenced the corridor completely. He turned then, slowly, to face his counsel. He was still wet-eyed, and he did not bother to hide it. "The contract I wrote was the act of a man who had forgotten what it meant to live. It ends tonight." Aldrich stepped forward, his gray brows drawn tight. "Your Majesty, the legal implications alone, the precedent this sets for royal succession. The bloodline protocols require that the mother of a royal heir be of documented—" "She is an omega of this territory," Draken said, his voice dropping to something very still and very certain. "She has carried the Thorn heir. She has bled for this kingdom. And I am naming her Luna." He held Aldrich's gaze for a long, cold moment. "Find me the clause in our ancient law that says a king cannot choose his own Luna, and I will hear your argument. Until then, you are dismissed." Aldrich's jaw worked silently. The 2 men behind him exchanged a glance. Then, one by one, they lowered their eyes, baring their necks in the smallest, stiffest inclination of submission that pride could permit. "As you command, Your Majesty," Aldrich said, the words clipped and precise as a sword stroke. He turned and led the others back down the corridor without another word, their footsteps fading into the stone. Draken watched them go, and then he turned back to June. She was looking at him with wide, wet eyes, the baby still tucked against her chest. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. "Yes," he said simply. "I did." He crossed to her and cupped her face in both his hands, careful of the child between them. "I have been a king for so long, I forgot how to be a man. You reminded me." June looked up at him, her vision blurring with tears she no longer had the will to fight. Inside her, something answered the feeling of his hands on her face, the certainty in his voice, the love she could no longer pretend was not there. Her wolf, her small, quiet, golden wolf, stirred. It had never been dormant from absence. It had simply been waiting, the way it had always waited, steady and unhurried, for the moment to be right. And now the moment was here. The golden wolf rose, fully and completely, standing within her with a brightness she had never felt before, a warmth that spread from the center of her chest outward until she felt lit from the inside. She gasped softly at the feeling. Draken felt it too. His black wolf, massive and dark and long grieving, stepped forward in his soul to meet her golden one, and where the 2 touched, something settled. Not the thunderclap of a fated bond written by the gods. Something quieter, and in its quietness, something chosen. A bond built from midnight conversations and ginger crackers left outside a door, from a hand pressed to a moving belly and a king kneeling on cold stone to ease a woman's aching feet. The wolf within her lifted its golden head, And Draken's black wolf answered with a sound that was not a howl, but something softer. A welcome home. June smiled, a real, radiant smile, and looked down at their son nestled in her arms. "He needs a name," she whispered, her voice thick with joy. A slow, brilliant smile broke across Draken's face, transforming his harsh features into something she had never seen from him before. Uncomplicated happiness. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his touch infinitely tender. "I was waiting for his mother to choose," he said softly. June looked down at the dark-haired, sleeping boy who had cost her everything and given her more in return. "Aiden," she whispered. "Aiden Thorne." It meant little fire, and he was, a small, fierce flame that had thawed a frozen king and lit up her entire world. Draken leaned in and pressed a soft, reverent kiss to her forehead. "Aiden Thorne," he repeated, his voice full of wonder. "Welcome home." And as he gathered both her and their son into his arms, June knew that was exactly what she was. Home. With her wolf awake, warm and golden within her, and her family finally complete, she felt whole for the first time in her life. Later, when they emerged into the gardens beneath the light of the moon, the two wolves ran together, his massive dark form and her small but glowing golden wolf racing through the silver-touched grass. A family bound by more than a contract, bound by love, by choice, and by a bond they had built, quietly and stubbornly, one honest moment at a time.